good.
At least for 30. We've got our panel, getting some lunch there. Right out, like towards the end of lunch. Presenter photographs, it says American 35. I assume that if there's that's it. Yeah, we were doing that at the beginning. Because there's going to be some people who okay. There's also a bit from what I was saying, there's also potential for afternoons that may not be alike until Ambassador Shannon. I couldn't really say but he's at the presentation speaking Thank you. We are 10:15. We should be around. So Ron Neumann, that is our gentleman that will be kicking this off. It's definitely not as on as it was last time. Do you think that would work to dampen the vibration? Quite possibly. Right here, podium. Got it. Yeah, there's wire.
Ladies and gentlemen, if I can ask you to find your seats, we'll actually start the program for which you've gotten up early this morning. Thank you very much for being here. I'm Ron Neumann. I'm the president of the American Academy of Diplomacy, the partner in crime with Thomas Jefferson Center. Has been putting this on. John, do you remember, is it 11 years, 12 years? I don't know. It's vanishing into the mists of time. But we started this quite a while back, and it's been so successful that we've continued to have a yearly program, although on different subjects. And just to give you a short commercial interruption about the American Academy of Diplomacy, it is a small organization, a non-governmental, non-partisan organization of retired senior practitioners of diplomacy, not all career diplomats, some who were political appointees, some from backgrounds in AID and intelligence, military, but all who have exercised the practice of diplomacy at senior levels. It was organized 4 years ago by luminaries like Henry Kissinger, Ellsworth Bunker, and several others. George Kennan was the founding member, and so members elect other members, which is why it's called the Academy. It doesn't teach a thing. Well, it tries to teach the State Department its business, but it does not teach in a normal academic sense. It has two main lines of endeavor. One is talking to Americans about why diplomacy is important and what it is, and in that endeavor we're here. Also, I would commend to you a podcast we have called American Diplomat. It is you can find it on our website if you Google American Academy of Diplomacy, which is regular chats with various diplomats about every conceivable aspect. In fact, it was just one, I don't know if you heard one, Venezuela. people that are last week, just came out. And there's another one which has now ceased to produce new programs, but it has about 80 of them up there called the General and the Ambassador, which a series of talks with commanding officers of the ambassadors they worked with, which we started because a lot of people know the military is out there doing things they have absolutely no idea what the diplomatic component is, although sometimes that is essential. In fact, I'd like to remind my Marine brethren, because they've been part of the State Department for years and years, their sword, their dress sword, is based on the Mameluke sword given to Lieutenant O'Banion from the Starling of Dara in North Africa. But I'd like to remind them that, in fact, the expedition was led by a consul. And in fact, it was the diplomacy that organized the ragtag little army that they led. And it was diplomacy that then gave it all back and kind of undid everything. But they wouldn't have been there without diplomacy. So the two have been intricately linked. The other part of the Academy's work is trying to tell the State Department how it might do things better. But unlike think tanks, when we have published a report, sometimes that is not the end of the project, that's the beginning of a second phase where we work for implementation. And so several years ago, we began working on a project to push against the risk aversion that was keeping diplomats from getting out on the street, in our view, sufficiently in some dangerous spots. And that also required a change to legislation, which we achieved last year, which is these days a very niche organization. We've got a very small issue, but a big one for us. And you know, anytime you can get anything passed in legislation in today's Congress, you feel pretty good about it. So that's the Academy in a nutshell. We're delighted to be back here, and it's now my duty to introduce Pete Gardiner Hallock, who is the interim president of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation. He's in that position since February 2023, but he has a much longer association with the foundation, since he helped to preserve their historic architecture and landscape as director of the Restorations Department, director of also the Restoration, Tutorial, Facilities Department. I think that means that almost any question you can come up with, he's going to be the person who gets to answer it, whether he knows the answer or not. So without further ado, Gardiner, please.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you on Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, or High Mountain, as he called it. From this mountaintop, we are overlooking two of Jefferson's great work. I'm referring, of course, to Monticello, a little mountain, but also Jefferson's beloved University of Virginia. Today, those works are collectively recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site and as a masterpiece of human creative genius. Monticello's history is also part of Jefferson's legacy. In 1771, he negotiated with his neighbor, Edward Carter, to purchase as much of the mountain as can be seen from my mountain and 100 yards beyond. It was his first land purchase and a wonderful early example of viewshed protection. Today, the foundation uses the land that Jefferson preserved to host important conferences vital to the preservation of democracy and self-governance. From this mountaintop, we know that Jefferson enjoyed looking west, imagining an expanding American empire of liberty. He was primarily thinking of the United States at that time, but I think he'd be excited at the prospect of a conference that brings together diplomats and historians to discuss crucial issues of democracy throughout the Americas. As Jefferson wrote in 1795, when reflecting on the international impact of the American Revolution, this ball of liberty is now so well in motion that it will roll around the globe. Monticello also takes great pride in upholding the Jeffersonian tradition of enlightening order as we gather for the 14th year of this conference. We're especially pleased to once again co-sponsor today's event with the American Academy of Diplomacy and UVA Center for Politics. Jefferson was deeply committed to diplomacy and political engagement. He loved nothing more than assembling enlightened guests and having them challenge each other to improve the world through their words and deeds. Collectively, our three organizations have endeavored to honor this commitment, and we are dedicated to keeping meaningful conversations alive. We look forward to doing the same today. On October 17, 1823, James Monroe wrote to Jefferson, seeking his input on foreign policy problems that would, 10 weeks later, resulted in the announcement of what would become known as the Monroe Doctrine. Jefferson responded that the issues raised in the documents, the risk of meddling in Europe and of Europe meddling in the Americas, were, to quote, the most momentous which has ever been offered to my contemplation since that of independence that made us a nation, and advised that our endeavor should surely be to make our hemisphere that of freedom. Of course, as we will undoubtedly hear today, the United States has not always been successful in that regard, but it's its failures as well as its principles that make a conference like this so compelling and important. As history has taught us, Jefferson and James Monroe shared many life experiences. They both studied at William and Mary, they were both governors of Virginia, they were both presidents of the United States, and although they died on different years, they both died on July 4th. After many years of friendship, and at the urging of Jefferson, Monroe purchased 1,000 acres of land in Albemarle County near Monticello, and the two officially became neighbors in November of 1799. And this morning, we have the distinct pleasure of welcoming the Executive Director of Highland and Monticello's great friend, Sara Bon-Harper, to speak with us. From 1999 to 2012, Sara was the Archaeological Research Manager at Monticello. She earned a PhD in anthropology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and her research interests include the analysis of archaeological data, landscapes of slavery, the construction of historic narratives for academic and popular audiences. The research she initiated at Highland led to the recent discovery of the archaeological remains of Monroe's main house and has opened a new chapter of site interpretation. She is committed to inspiring imaginations, broadening interest in the exploration of the past. And now, ladies and gentlemen, let's give a warm welcome to our great friend and colleague, Sara Bon-Harper.
Thank you for the welcome, and thank you for the chance to speak with you this morning. It's truly a pleasure to be here. So Monroe's home, that we now call Highland, many of you, if you've been around this area in particular for a while, you might remember as Ash Lawn. That was the 19th century, later 19th century name for the property, and Monroe called it Highland. So in 2016, when we made our big research announcement that Gardiner just referred to, we reclaimed the name Highland, which had been hyphenated as Ashlawn Highland for several decades, to really focus on that period of primary importance, the period of Monroe's ownership. So if you're wondering what the connection is between Highland and Ash Lawn, now you know it is the same place. It's the same place in some ways, but in many ways it is a very different place. And so I'm going to spend just a couple minutes talking to you about what we're doing there and the significance of that work. So Monroe did move to Highland to be closer to his friend and neighbor Jefferson, and he did move in November of 1799. We're very close to the exact date there. He had purchased the property in 1793, which was just before he went to France to serve as minister to France under Washington. And that was part of a long career in public service where he called Highland home. It was his home intermittently. He was away serving in many different roles while he was there. And he also, especially later, had another home in Northern Virginia, in Loudoun County, called Oak Hill. And that's near Aldie today. It's in private hands. But this was the governor's house. Monroe moved in just moments before he became Virginia's governor in the first of his elected terms. The property has belonged to William and Mary since 1974. It was a gift at the death of the last private owner. the connection with a state institution of higher education 120 miles down the interstate is in part because Monroe also, as we've heard, just like Jefferson went to William and Mary, and also there was a connection between that owner and the then president of the college. And so it has been thoroughly part of William and Mary since then, but only in the last decade has it been serving the teaching and research purposes of the university. And that's something that we are developing now, and we have collaborations across William and Mary with a variety of disciplines, not just history, anthropology, and archaeology, but geology, biology, and especially the Institute for Integrative Conservation, emphasizing the condition and use of our 535 acres currently under our control. All right. So in 2016, we made a really big announcement, which was the culmination of a couple of years of intensive work. To be fair, there had been questions at various points in the past about the veracity of the story of Highland. And this large yellow house really dominates the landscape. It's from the 1870s, so much beyond Monroe's sale of the property, his departure, and his later death. But that reoriented the landscape and really confused matters. And also the fact was that the 1799 main house burned in its entirety shortly after Monroe sold it. We think it was late in the year of 1829. There seems to be no newspaper account of that fire, which is surprising. So I suspect it's out there, but not yet identified, or maybe not preserved, but more likely there is a copy somewhere. And so if you're looking in your trunks in your attic and you find some newspaper clippings, be sure to think of me. So there's one letter from January, and another letter from February of 1830 that from the then owner, then that's why we think it was 1829. But Monroe, of course, was a recent, very popular two-term president at that time, so it would be really surprising not to have that noted somewhere. And so we identified the remains and then eventually much of the outline of this 1799 house. And we also corrected the identification of this little house, which for generations, as early as 1885, was considered a remnant wing of the Monroe main house. That is completely false. It actually, in footprint, looks a lot like Weaver's Cottage or Building E up on Mulberry Row. And so we were able to tell through architectural study and through dendrochronology, as well as our understanding of it, that this was the 1818 guest house that enslaved men Peter Mallory and George Williams constructed on Monroe's behalf in 1818. And so this provides all kinds of opportunity to create new stories, to re-examine the core of the site interpretation, not just for physical correctness, but also for the inclusion of appropriate stories and how we think of the use of Highland in conveying American history. And so, since 2016, we have been creating new installations, first in the 1818 guest house, which you see, if I can point, on the far right for everybody. And then most recently this fall, in the reconstructed quarters building, which is on the two on the left. And we've also been collaborating with a council of descendant advisors, indicated in the rain photo, both on interpretation and on programming, on educational and public programming. And the Council of Descendant Advisors is a really key piece to our approach to understanding the site and our approach to bringing it to the public. We operate on an understanding that the history should be, at least in part, directed by the people whose families and communities for generations have been so considerably impacted by the history that occurred at Highland. And so the Descendants Council is a key collaborator in what we're doing. And so the new installations, some brand new this fall, so if you haven't visited, please do, and some coming up still this winter to be done in the next month, and then another piece in January. So worth coming to see us and considering what we are doing here. So we are working on, through these exhibitions and programming, Monroe's career in the context of the people and events that impacted Highland. And we hope that by the key pieces of history told through the important elements there. And so we're working with these perspectives and the impact of history and on community initiatives that probably is a topic for another day. And so we will continue installing. You can see today, if you look down the backside of Monte Alto, that is Highland down there. We are just around the corner, so please do come visit us. And so a little bit about the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe's address to Congress, December of 1823, it in some ways caps Monroe's career, and I leave it to you all to talk about the ways that it's impacted the 200 years following that. But that career started at William and Mary, and really, I think, took an important turn in the American Revolution when Monroe, under General George Washington, fought and was one of the few wounded, in fact, nearly died at the Battle of Trenton. And then following that, there was a series of elected and appointed offices at the state and national level, and including serving overseas. And so, when he was swept away from his fourth elected term as governor of Virginia, those were one-year terms, and he became Madison's Secretary of State and then war, I think that really solidified then when he was the next president, his view on the world. And really what I consider as the key piece is, and I pose this maybe for us to hold in our minds and see if this was what happened. The Monroe Doctrine reflects this key element of Monroe's career of geopolitics and preservation of the young nation. So Monroe really thought that growing and preserving that fragile democracy that was created in 1776 and then built through the subsequent decades, I really think that was the key piece. We can maybe talk about evidence in the Missouri crisis, but certainly in the Monroe Doctrine. And we see through that Monroe's willingness to work offstage with collaborative efforts and to be the executive that signs off and makes this happen. So maybe consider that in the arc of Monroe's career as perhaps what he was most committed to was that growth and preservation, and that sense that the democracy should not be taken for granted and took regular tending, which I think is something that we all understand deeply, and in fact probably we'll talk about at various points today. So, I will pivot now, if you will, to introducing our next speaker. And I would like to say also that I am learning with you, and so if you have questions or comments, please talk to me throughout the day, and I'll be listening with enthusiasm to these assembled viewpoints. And the history and diplomacy that bring the Monroe Doctrine forward are always something that are relevant, so thank you. And so we turn our attention to Timothy Walker, who's our next speaker, and he's a professor of history at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, where he serves on the executive board of the Center for Portuguese Studies and Culture, and as graduate faculty for the doctoral program in Luso-Afro-Brazilian Studies and Theory, and as a Fulbright program advisor. He was previously director of Tegas Press and director of the UMass in Lisbon Study Abroad program. Dr. Walker earned a BA at Highland College and a PhD from Boston University, and has significant international experience in his academic career. He was the recipient of a Fulbright dissertation fellowship to Portugal and a doctoral research fellowship from the Portuguese Institute. He holds a research affiliation and previous visiting professorships at universities in Lisbon and grant-funded postdoctoral work in India. Walker has also been named a fellow of the Portuguese Orient Foundation, the Luso-American Development Foundation, and the Calouste-Gulbenkian Foundation. In 2018, Walker was appointed a guest investigator of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, drawing historic climate data from archived whaling logbooks, Portuguese, colonial, and other maritime documentation. Dr. Walker will lay out the historic foundation of America's commitment to democracy and the Monroe Doctrine with a particular focus on Brazil. Will you please join me in a welcome?
So good morning, muito bom dia, for those of you who speak Portuguese. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm very, very grateful to the American Academy of Diplomacy for the opportunity to address all of you today. Thank you. My job this morning a little bit is to speak about something that we don't often learn a lot about in the United States, and that is the sort of Lusophone or Portuguese-speaking dimension of the history that influences the young United States in the 18th and into the 19th century. And so I want to speak with you today about a variety of factors that influenced the diplomacy of the young United States in the lead up to the decision to promulgate the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, 200 years ago. And to try to introduce you to some of the key figures and some of the key factors that really generated this need to have a Monroe Doctrine. But it wasn't only about the Spanish-speaking Americans. It also involves, very importantly, part of the Portuguese-speaking world as well. So my first slide is this rather stuffy academic title, but I thought I would add a kind of secondary one, which is maybe a little easier for us to get our head around, Portuguese, Brazilian independence, and the genesis of the Monroe Doctrine. And as I was thinking about preparing this talk, I grew less fond of the first title, which I initially supplied, and more fond of the second, so I thought I would share that with you as well. So, the Lusophone world, the Portuguese-speaking world, loomed very large in the consciousness of the United States founders. And the reason for this had a lot to do with trade, it had a lot to do with existing trade in the 19th century, even during the colonial period, and it had a lot to do with the importance of the various stepping stone islands in the Atlantic, which were controlled by the Portuguese crown. So diplomacy and maritime trade are very much in the forethought and in the forefront of thought for the founding fathers. And so if we look at trade routes in the Atlantic world that generated out of Portuguese areas, there are many connections with the United States. And this begins quite early on. We're perhaps very familiar with the popular wine amongst the folks that inhabited tomes. They bought enormous quantities of it by the barrel load. And so some of the earliest trade to the United States and colonial North America was in the wine trade from Portugal, but other things too. So let's think about some of those. Madeira wine, of course, but George Washington preferred Portuguese-made salt. Portugal was a major salt producer, and salt was an essential component of trade and of preserving food in the 18th century. So he used salt to treat the many tons of fish that he collected in the Potomac River. And if we think about Brazil, Brazil was really the jewel in the crown of the Portuguese royal family. Brazil was valuable for enormous numbers of reasons. It's a very big place. It had extraordinary natural resources, but it's the center of sugar production until the early 1700s in the world. It's the center, one of the centers of tobacco production. But by the mid-18th century, the real story in Brazil is the amount of gold that is being mined and being brought out of Brazil. And that gold, that precious metal, is feeding the economy of the entire Atlantic world. It's becoming part of the lubricant that lubricates trade. And so when we think about gold, let's think about the form that it comes in. This is a typical Portuguese coin from the early 18th century. It's referred to in the English-speaking world as a Joe, but the person pictured there is King João, or John, who rules from 1706 until 1750. And these coins circulated widely in the English-speaking world. There were other versions of them that were smaller, but it was always a welcome piece of trade because the joão was a very high quality of gold, 22 karat, and it was also known that merchants in Brazil often paid in hard currency, in hard specie, so very popular coin. This wealth coming out of Brazil makes the Portuguese monarchy the envy of the age. King João modeled himself. He's an absolutist monarch on the model of Louis XIV. And he has the deep pockets because of the wealth being generated by Brazil to do all kinds of public works in Portugal. So the city of Lisbon, which is the best and most strategically important port in Southwest Europe. It's important in time of general war in Europe, but it's very well protected and it's an extraordinary center of trade, historically from the Far East, but increasingly in the 18th century because of the trade from Brazil. And so it's really the envy of Western European monarchs. Now, of course, all of this labor in Brazil is being done by enslaved persons from sub-Saharan Africa. And what we often don't realize in the United States is just how big the volume of enslaved people from Africa to Brazil was. About 40% of the entire transatlantic slave trade comes from Portuguese-speaking Africa and into Brazil, and they're doing much of the work. It's 10 times the volume that comes to what is today the United States. So 40%, pretty massive number of people, almost 4.5 million people. But what they're doing is generating unimaginable quantities of gold. For over half a century, the average amount of gold coming from Brazil being shipped back to Portugal was 10,000 kilos a year, 22,000 pounds of gold. For half a century, the peak year was 1725, and it's something like 22,000 kilos worth of gold. And this is just the registered amount. It doesn't include smuggling, which historians think was about another third larger. So they're generating enormous amounts of profit with gold being mined in Brazil. And then in the early 18th century, they also discovered diamonds in western Bahia state. And so we start to get diamonds coming out of Brazil as well. What do they do with all this wealth? They build extraordinary buildings. This is the convent of Mafra. During the reign of João V, again, first half of the 18th century, they're doing all kinds of extraordinary public buildings. Many of you have been to Lisbon. You know this extraordinary aqueduct that was built in the 1720s, and it carries water to Lisbon. So this and many, many other things, as well as private palaces that were being built on the wealth of Brazil. Well, João V dies in 1750. His son, also an absolutist monarch, José, takes over, and he's going to rule for the next quarter century. And he inherits this exceptionally wealthy kingdom. But 5 years later, Lisbon is destroyed in one of the worst earthquakes ever to hit continental Europe. The 1st of November, 1755, there's an earthquake and a tsunami, and this causes widespread destruction. Somewhere between 10 and 30,000 people die. This is a matter of debate historically, but the city is more or less flattened, and it has to be rebuilt. With the wealth coming from Brazil, they have the means to do that, but how do they feed themselves? And this is where one of the earliest connections with British North America takes root. Portugal becomes dependent on North American grain. Imports of grain from Virginia, from Pennsylvania, and so a big part of what is feeding Portugal is grain from the New World. They're also bringing in other kinds of foodstuffs, and the exchange between Portugal and British North America is pretty extraordinary. There's a lot of salt, there's wine that I mentioned, but what else is being brought in? Citrus fruits, a lot of things that are shipped across. So if you speak any of the, in Turkish or I believe Arabic too, the word for an orange is a portugal, because that's where the fruit, they associated it with Portugal. So anyway, there's this very important connection trade connection between British North America. The Prime Minister of José is the Marquês de Pombal, who's Prime Minister during his entire reign. He is an autocratic, heavy-handed organizer, but Lisbon is built according to plans that he is rebuilt according to plans that he approves. He has served as a diplomat in the court of St. James in London. He was also a diplomat in the court of Maria Theresa in Austria. And he comes back, he's what the Portuguese call an estrangeirado, someone who has been influenced by his experience as a diplomat in a country that was heavily Roman Catholic, very inward-looking. He brings outside perspectives back to Portugal, and so he wants to change the country fundamentally from the character that it had under John V. Let's take a step backwards, very far backwards, to the 15th century and figure out how Brazil becomes Portuguese. So when Christopher Columbus comes back, his first port of call back in Europe, Lisbon, Portugal, and he reports what he has found, and the Portuguese are a bit dubious because he hasn't been gone long enough to actually have been to the Indies. But the Portuguese realize that they need to define their territory, their turf in the Atlantic. And so they enter into negotiation, which ultimately becomes the Treaty of Tordesillas. And the Treaty of Tordesillas divides the world with papal consent between the Spanish territories and the Portuguese territories. But they draw a line, 300 defined as three, the Portuguese renegotiate after the papal line of demarcation. They draw a line 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, and this becomes the line that separates Spanish-controlled America from Portuguese-controlled the rest of the world. What the Portuguese probably knew, and what the Spanish didn't know, is that a big chunk of Brazil sticks out eastward of the line. And this is why Brazil becomes the only Portuguese-speaking colony of South America. Now, over the next 250 years, the Portuguese develop Brazil, but they extend their zone of control westward past that treaty line. And so in 1750, there has to be another treaty that recognizes Portuguese gains and Portuguese occupation in western Brazil, and this is the Treaty of Madrid from 1750. So with that treaty, that sort of settles most of the question, but there's another remaining one, and that is who controls the mouth of the Rio de la Plata? Who controls the main artery into that part of South America? The Portuguese have a colony called the Colonia of Sacramento. It's right at the mouth, and the Spanish are going to contest that territory. So they send what at the time is the largest military expedition that the Spanish have ever mounted to the New World. They send it to the mouth of the Plate River, and they attack the colony of Sacramento, which somehow manages to hold on. The Portuguese, Marquês de Pombal and José I, say, what are we going to do to stop the Spanish from taking our territory? So they turn to the British because of this very old alliance signed in the 14th century, 1386, the Treaty of Windsor, which is the oldest alliance. It's the oldest diplomatic and treaty alliance between two states in the world. But the British have a slight problem of their own, and that's that here in North America, the Americans have, upstart rebels that they are, have started to contest British control of North America. And so Lord North says to the Portuguese, we're very sorry, but we have our hands full with North America. We're not going to be able to help you with a military expedition to relieve the colony of Sacramento. Marquês de Pombal is a very savvy diplomat, and he has looked at the situation in Brazil and remembers that the Brazilian and Portuguese colonists in Brazil successfully expelled the Dutch. And so Pombal knows, or at least he believes, that the English will ultimately not be militarily successful in controlling the rebellion in North America. He says, look, and what he does is he writes a letter to his diplomat in London, a letter that was meant to be intercepted and read by the English. And he says, you know, they're never going to be able to do it. What they should do is just buy off the rebels, give them lands, give them bribes, and that will solve their problem. The British do not take his advice, as we know. However, the Portuguese are also in a difficult position. Because of this oldest alliance, they feel that they are very adverse to the idea of throwing off the authority of a rightful monarch. So the Portuguese want to support their old ally, the English, but they don't necessarily want to lose an important trading partner, which is the British colonies in North America. So they're in a bit of a bind. What they do is they claim neutrality. The Portuguese come out and say, we're going to be neutral, but we're going to close our ports to trade to ships from British North America. And so this is done on the 5th of July, 1776, obviously without the knowledge of what else was going on the day before, but this is the letter that closes the ports. And this infuriates the Americans because they think that if Portugal is going to be neutral, that they ought to be able to continue to trade with Portugal as a neutral party. No less a person than Sam Adams, John Adams, beg your pardon, who's Secretary of State at the time. He favors a policy in which the United States ought to declare war on Portugal. He's incensed, and one of his letters just reveals how incensed he was. He says, "Pray, is it not necessary to think a little of Portugal? Under her present system of neutrality, as they call it, the ports of Portugal are as advantageous to England as any of her own, and more injurious to the trade of Spain and America, and if not of France. This little impotent morsel of a state ought not to do so much mischief so unjustly. If she is neutral, let her be neutral, not say she is neutral and be otherwise." I love this quote because it is so insightful about how, well, on one hand, how precarious the young United States trade was, and how it's very telling about how important trade with Portuguese-speaking areas was. Everyone wanted access to the markets in Brazil. And the young United States was one of those as well that thought that having free and open access to Brazil would be important. The mercantilist theory by which the Portuguese royal family viewed their colonial system, and especially the jewel of their crown in Brazil, meant that they kept Brazil closed. But events were going to conspire to make that change. By the way, the peacekeeper here is Ben Franklin, who initiates a separate diplomatic correspondence from Paris and calms the waters so that the U.S. never declares war on Portugal. Now, José I dies in 1777. His daughter, also in the mindset of an absolutist monarch, becomes queen in 1777, and she wants to chart a different path. She recognizes that the United States, now having been, they've won at Saratoga, they are becoming a possible large power in North America, and she sees that the British influence on Portuguese foreign policy is too great. She wants to try to counterbalance that by moving closer to the Americas, but she does have to abide by this policy of keeping the ports closed. What she encourages, therefore, is for Portuguese ships to go to the Caribbean and trade with American merchants in some of the neutral Caribbean islands, principally those that are controlled by the Dutch. She also has this policy, there's this wonderful Portuguese idiom, "Só para o Inglês ver," which literally means just for the Englishman to see. It's a facade, it's for show. That's what the idiom means, "Só para o Inglês ver." And so a lot of, I've made great use of that idiom in explaining Portuguese policy over the years. There are so many things that this can be applied to. The problem with the Spanish is resolved in 1777 in the First Treaty of Santo Ildefonso. And so they resolve the problem of the River Plate, and peace is restored between the Spanish and Portuguese, which is helpful as the Portuguese are going to go through some issues soon with trade in the Iberian Peninsula. In 1783, Maria rescinds the order to close the ports. She opens the ports to United States shipping, and Portugal effectively becomes the first nation, besides France and the Netherlands, that had recognized U.S. independence during the conflict. Portugal's the first one to recognize, even before Britain recognizes the United States as an independent country, Portugal's the first to do that. And so John Adams has a bit of a change of heart. This is the first treaty that is negotiated between the between the Portuguese and the United States. It's negotiated in 1786. It is seen as a model of Enlightenment diplomacy between the powers of the world. There are provisions in it for example, people captured during wartime and the treatment of prisoners. And so it's a very modern document. It is seen as such by historians of diplomacy. But it's never ratified, but the treaty's terms are followed into the early 19th century. George Washington becomes, of course, as commander-in-chief, he was aware of the policies of the Portuguese. He understood that they needed to, for diplomatic reasons, maintain their relationship with Britain, but he also understood the importance of trade, because he'd been trading with Portugal himself for a generation or more. He was very fond of Madeira wine. He felt that Portuguese salt was the best you could get, and so he wanted to reinitiate the trade negotiations and the trade relationship with Portugal. Jefferson, though, was in Europe for part of the late 18th century and is hearing rumors about Brazil wanting to declare its independence. He's approached twice, 1786 and 1789, by Brazilian activists who want to break away, on the model of the United States, to break away from Portugal as a mother country. He is gracious. He expresses a general enthusiasm for the idea, but he doesn't offer U.S. substantive aid, no arms, no money, just sort of moral support. The first ambassador to Portugal from the United States is David Humphreys. He had been an aide-de-camp to Washington during the Revolution, Connecticut-born guy. And I thought you might all be interested in seeing his diplomatic credential, which is presented to him, of course, signed by Washington and Jefferson. This is in the National Archives of Portugal, and it's just a simple document, but it gives him allows him to present his diplomatic credentials to the Portuguese crown. His counterpart, coming the other way, was a long-term diplomat, Cipriano Ribeiro Frei, first Portuguese minister to the United States, and he was very impressed with Mr. Washington. One of the things that struck him was that diplomatic protocol here in the New World was very different from diplomatic protocol in Europe. He wrote in his diary and in diplomatic dispatches that he was just astonished that Washington's chair was the equal of his own, as he was when he met Washington the first time. He was also struck by the fact that when he arrives in the United States, Washington is out personally leading troops to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. And so this is something that really astonished him. John Quincy Adams, son of the president, was, well, not yet, but he was appointed to be the first full diplomat to Portugal in 1797. Washington appoints him, but when John Adams is elected and then takes the presidency, he recalls him, his son, and reassigns him. So he never actually becomes the ambassador to Portugal. But as we all know from our history, there are other things going on in Europe at the time. John Adams, though, being mindful of the importance of Portugal, hatches a plan to reward the Portuguese with a prime location for their embassy. And I think that you will all be very surprised by this. Here, of course, is L'Enfant's plan for Washington, D.C., and you see the National Mall and where the White House is. But this is where the Portuguese embassy was meant to be. A grant of land, I can't tell you exactly the space, but it's right to the right-hand side as you're facing the National Mall. That where the star is, was where the land grant to give an embassy to the Portuguese was originally cited in 1797 upon payment of $1. The Portuguese were given this grant. This is the map, and the highlighted areas where the embassy was meant to be. The White House is also there. This was waterfront property at the time. The Tiber Creek was there, and of course the National Mall wasn't extended to where the Jefferson and Lincoln memorials are. But I mean, this is a prime location. This is a place that indicates how important and the aspirations of U.S. trade to be able to engage with Brazil. It would have been on the ellipse today in modern terms, just a bit beyond where the Washington Monument is built. Now, of course, this was never done through the 19th century, and in fact, the issue of the loss of Brazil to the Portuguese has a big impact on why this embassy was never built. I also wanted to mention William Jarvis, who is the U.S. Charge d'Affaires and Consul General in Portugal. The important thing here to be mindful of is the dates, 1802 to 1811. So he is the representative during a very tumultuous time in Portuguese and indeed European history. He also has the distinction of introducing merino sheep to the United States, which I find rather interesting. Now, I live in New Bedford, Massachusetts, the heart of whaling. A lot of my research nowadays has to do with the whaling business. But I would be remiss if I did not mention that whaling, which is one of the top whaling products, whale oil, is one of the top exports of the United States in the early 19th century. And whaling is dependent on Portuguese-speaking territories for repairs, for crew, for provisions. And so the islands, particularly the Azores, where I live today, half the population is Azorian descended. Madeira, Cape Verde Islands, and Brazil. These are all places where the whaling industry takes root. So, as you all know, the French Revolution begins in 1789. By the early 19th century, the French are in control of most of Western Europe. What they're not in control of is is Portugal. And the Napoleonic continental system wants to close all continental trade to the English, to isolate them. But Portugal represents a big hole. And so the French issue an ultimatum to the Portuguese. They say, look, you're going to close your ports to the British, you're going to seize British assets, and you're going to keep Portugal closed to British trade. The Portuguese refuse. They can't do that to their oldest ally. And so the French invaded. In 1807, in August, they issued their ultimatum. The ultimatum was refused, and so on the 19th of November, they invade down the valley of the Tagus River from Spain, and they're threatening to take Lisbon. At this point, the Portuguese royal family panics because they didn't have the means to defend the country, and so they decide to leave Lisbon for another major city within their empire. They board between 10 and 15,000 people, the entire court, the royal family. They take the National Archives, they take enormous amounts of government documentation, and they embark on 40 ships protected by the British Royal Navy. And the day before the French march into Lisbon, they sail out and they head to Rio de Janeiro. The Prince Regent, the son of Maria, is another João, of course, who becomes eventually João VI, but he is the Prince Regent. And he's actually effectively ruling the empire because his mother has been declared unfit. So he's the person with whom diplomatic negotiations are taking place. When he lands in Salvador de Bahia, he becomes the first sitting European monarch to set foot in the New World, and he creates a capital in Rio de Janeiro that becomes the first instance of a European power and a European empire being ruled from America. This, though, he has to jumpstart trade, and so he issues a new proclamation that for the first time opens Brazilian ports, where the royal family is now, to trade from any friendly nation, including the United States. So this is in 1807, and it takes effect in 1808. He creates a situation where we have an established Portuguese court at Rio de Janeiro. It's going to be there for 12 years, from 1808 to 1821. In 1810, he extends the Anglo-Portuguese alliance and creates trade with Brazil on par with what it had been in Portugal. So it basically gives a most favored nation status to England for trade with Brazil. And he also issues a royal decree that the status of the colony of Brazil is raised to a status on par with Portugal, which, as you can imagine, irritates a lot of people in Portugal. But this is important for what happens next. Maria dies in 1816, and João ascends the throne as King João VI of Portugal and Brazil, and the other Portuguese colonies around the world, including Macau and Goa in India and various other places. Meanwhile, in Portugal, the British have intervened, and they've sent an army under Wellington to drive the French out. There are numerous battles, numerous campaigns, 3 of them, and between 1808 and 1811, Wellington, who shows the military genius that he was, manages to drive the French out of Portugal. And so the British are really the people who are saving the Kingdom of Portugal for later reoccupation by the Portuguese crown. The French are forced to withdraw, and the lower fellow, Beresford, General Beresford, becomes the military government in the absence of the Portuguese royal family, which is enjoying life in the tropics in Rio de Janeiro. This is the problem. The Portuguese royal family, having set up shop and having endured a really horrible passage 2 months at sea from Portugal to Rio de Janeiro under very difficult conditions, they don't want to go back. And so, even after the Treaty of Versailles, 1815, the war's resolved, Battle of Waterloo, there's no threat anymore from the French. The people in Portugal, the aristocrats and the merchants and so on, they want the royal family to return. The royal family doesn't want to return. And so this all comes to a head about 5 years later. But before we get there, let's meet someone else. Many of you are aware of this extraordinary person. And we want to mention him particularly because he was the particular friend of one Mr. Thomas Jefferson. The Abad, Correa de Sara, polymath, a naturalist. He and Jefferson shared many interests. They could have extraordinarily wide-ranging conversations. And so he becomes a real friend of Jefferson. He was a frequent visitor at Monticello. It's the Abad Correa de Sara who gives the moniker to Washington, D.C., the city of magnificent distances. Because when he's first there, he sees this layout that Ron Font had envisioned, but very few buildings were prepared yet. And so he's trying to see the future idea of D.C. from the perspective of Ron Font and the city of magnificent distances. This is his quarters. We had the great good fortune to visit it yesterday, and so he had a room that was his room at Monticello that is still there and well preserved. So, the crisis for the Portuguese comes in 1820, and now we're getting very close. Things are starting to happen. There are already in Spanish-speaking America, there have been attempts and successful bids for independence from some of the Spanish colonies. Chronologically, we're getting very close to the Monroe Doctrine. What is the crisis that confronts the Portuguese? Well, there's a liberal revolt. The ideals of the French Revolution and of the American Revolution have spread during the revolutionary period of the French Revolutionary Wars. And instead of having an absolute monarchy, many people in Portugal, the merchant class and indeed some of the aristocracy, feels that it's a good idea to contain and control the power of the monarchy. So they want a constitution, they want a constitutional monarchy, and they want to have a parliament, a corte. So, in the absence of the king, they have a revolt. It begins in Porto, this is the industrial city in the north, and they create a parliament, and they create a constitution. To King João, off in Rio de Janeiro, they send messages and say, hey, we need you to come back because we want you to swear your allegiance and to submit to this new constitution. And we will not, oh, and by the way, we also want to rescind the declaration that Brazil is a kingdom on par with Portugal. No, we want it to be subordinated as a colony. This presents a very big problem for the royal family. And so what do? João VI says, okay, and by the way, Beresford, the colonial governor, the British governor, sails all the way to Brazil and basically advises him to say, look, you better come back or you're going to lose your kingdom because they're going to declare independence. João decides to return to Portugal, submit to the forces of the parliament and of the constitution. When he hedges his bets, he leaves his son, makes him Prince Regent. He temporarily abdicates the throne in Brazil and leaves his son in charge of Brazil, and he sails back to Portugal. He arrives in Lisbon in July of 1821. His son, Don Pedro, sees the writing on the wall, realizes that the constitutionalists in Portugal are not going to be cowed by his father, João VI. And when the parliament reissues their demand that not only his father, João VI, but also the son needs to also return to Portugal and submit to the Constitution, he says, no, I'm not going to do that. He says, fico, I'm going to stay. And he declares independence. So the independence of Brazil, contrary to most of the other historical reasons why Spanish-speaking America becomes independent in order to be republics, Brazil is just the opposite. Brazil becomes independent so that it can continue to be an absolute monarchy in 1821 and 1822. Use the independence of Brazil with great enthusiasm because it means that they will no longer, they can continue to trade with Brazil. And there is the promise that eventually Brazil, o país do futuro, the country of the future, will eventually become, with one hopes, a republic. But for the time being, in the early, in the 1820s, the idea was that we want Brazil to be independent. We don't want any meddling of Portugal or any other foreign power in Brazil. So an independent Brazil might be induced to eventually follow the Republican ideas of the Americans. But for the time being, it was mainly trade and interest in trade with Brazil that inspired the Monroe administration to embrace a newly independent Brazil, even though it wasn't a republic. So we have President James Monroe, and the proof of that is that in March of 1822, as he's recognizing the independence of Argentina and Chile and Peru and Colombia and Mexico, at the time when Brazil becomes independent, the United States does not hesitate, and it is the first foreign power to recognize, with the acceptance of diplomatic representatives from Brazil sent by now Emperor Pedro to the United States to create trade negotiations with the U.S. The United States does not hesitate and recognizes Brazilian independence before any other power in Western Europe, because the Western Europeans did not want to see yet another instance of a rightful monarch being denied their rightful colonial power or kingdom. So I'm going to leave it there. I think I'm to time, and want to say thank you very much. Muito obrigado. And I hope that this helps to contextualize something that is often not discussed, the Portuguese-speaking sphere of the Atlantic world. Thank you. I'd be happy to.
Folks have questions, we have a little time for questions. The recording is waiting. I have two very quick questions. One is, you discussed a treaty of 1786, saying it was never ratified by the Senate.
Correct.
Of course, there is no Senate in 1786. There is no Constitution yet.
Fair point.
And so it strikes me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that even though the treaty is not ratified in the U.S., or, as best I can tell from a very quick search, ratified in Portugal, that it operates as a treaty for, as you said, until the early 19th century. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. Even though the treaty isn't, with the new Senate that comes into being merely 2 years later, and of course things are traveling very slowly, so the treaty is negotiated prior to the Senate, but the Senate would have had an opportunity to ratify it in 1789, and they don't.
But it's not rejected either, so it
No.
just kind of sits there.
They abide by the treaty that had been negotiated, they follow its rules and regulations, but it is not, it doesn't take the force of law.
And now a more complicated question.
All right.
Brazil is the largest slaveholding country in the Western Hemisphere at the time of the Monroe Doctrine.
Yes.
By the time of the Monroe Doctrine, there was a very viable and very active anti-slavery movement in England, pushing to end slavery all over the world. The British are aggressively suppressing the African slave trade in the Northern Hemisphere, and Brazil and Cuba, Cuba and to Cuba as well. But there's still an active slave trade into Brazil that is legal. The U.S. has, in theory, banned the African slave trade, but we're not doing much about it. And there are a fair number of slaves who are coming into the U.S. illegally. To what extent is the institution of slavery pushing Monroe, especially in the context of Brazil? Because what, of course, the Virginia aristocracy wants is another large slaveholding country in the New World. Jefferson, of course, had been apoplectic about Haiti, and with the French no longer having this, again, very large entity in Haiti, and British Caribbean slavery exists, but anybody with half a brain knows it's not going to last very long, and in fact it won't. So I'm wondering, is there a connection for Monroe and the administration to preserve slavery in the American South by having a strong connection with this other very large slaveholding entity in South America?
That's a wonderful, wonderful question, and that ought to be the subject of a book somewhere.
I know some publishers I can introduce you to.
So there is an important treaty, an Anglo-Portuguese treaty in 1817, that outlaws the transit of enslaved people across the Atlantic north of the equator. But the Portuguese and the Brazilians, and they're of course deeply invested in this very valuable trade. And furthermore, they, because of Angola, where 37% of the entire volume of the transatlantic slave trade originates, they want to protect slave trading south of the line, south of the equator. And that continues legally until 1850. From the point of view of the United States, and you asked a question which I confess I can't answer. I can speculate a little bit that exactly as you say, the politics of enslavement, which were so much in the forefront of people's minds here in North America at the founding of the nation and into the early 19th century, they had, it was in their economicus to leave slavery off the table. I don't believe it's part of that Treaty of 1786 or subsequent treaties. The United States views the sphere of national policy as being for the Brazilians to decide once they're independent. And so they don't have a very strong policy. The Americans don't. The United States doesn't have a very strong policy about slavery in South America. And indeed, after the U.S. Civil War in 1865, a significant number of southern slaveholders decamped to Brazil, where they found a city where they can continue to have plantations and hold slaves for another 23 years. Slavery is now outlawed in Brazil until 1888, the last of the, with so-called Golden Law, the Lei Dourado, which in signing that law and ending slavery in Brazil, it brings down the royal family. And that is ultimately the last straw that leads to the founding of the Republic in Brazil. So I'm sorry that I can't specifically answer your question, but that's, the context is what strikes me as being the reason why there needs to be a book on this. Thank you. Yeah, there's a question in the back, there's another question. By the way, just as an aside, Portuguese, I've mentioned before that it's not a very well appreciated history or sphere of Portuguese, but Portuguese is the #1 spoken language in the Southern Hemisphere. It's probably the 6th most spoken language in the world, but in the Southern Hemisphere, because of 220 million Brazilians, 70 million people in Angola, and 40 million people in Mozambique or something like that, it's the #1 spoken language in the Southern Hemisphere. And as a diplomatic language, it's useful even today throughout big parts of the sub-Saharan African world, and I've used it in 4 continents. It's a very useful language. Yes, sir?
Related, but somewhat maybe higher level and simpler to the last question. What was the reaction of the British Empire, or British Crown, whatever, to the division between Portugal and Brazil?
So they saw this, the British saw this as an opportunity as well, because Brazil had opened its ports to English trade. A lot of English investment, which, if you know anything about the Madeira wine trade or the port wine trade and a number of other important industries in Portugal itself, it's controlled by the English. There's a very heavy investment of English capital in Portugal, and they wanted to do the same thing with Brazil. And independent or not, the Brazilian, Pedro, was very happy to receive not only economic investment in Brazil, but also military assistance. So in the subsequent, there's a short but passionate, if you will, war between father and son. João VI tries to maintain Portuguese control over Brazil for about a year. There are Portuguese troops in Brazil at the time that independence is claimed. The British see this as an opportunity, and so they send ships, there are privateers, there are British military commanders who serve the Brazilian royal family, and they end up being deeply involved in the growing economy of Brazil immediately after independence. But the Americans, the U.S. is trying to do the same thing. And so there are vying interests in Brazil economically from outside as people are trying to gain a foothold and to extract trade out of Brazil to the extent that they can.
We are going to try very hard to stay on time, so I'm going to have to cut off questions. But Tim will be here, and I certainly invite you to talk with Tim and we'll have fascinating comments. I certainly knew nothing about Portugal and Brazil's role in the development of the Monroe Doctrine, because of the rather backward nature of the relationship. With that, we have, first of all, thank you, Tim, for working. We have about a 10-minute break. We're going to try to stick to that. I will tell you restrooms are upstairs and downstairs, but we will be back here for the diplomats panel in 10 minutes.
I think they have a blog. Yeah, I don't think it's like I can take it off. They have a blog right now. It just yeah, maybe they will. That's okay. We're just going to turn it really fast. Yeah. So I'm just going to do it. It's in my bag.
All right, here we go. Here we go. Showtime. Yes, ma'am. Here we go. Thank you.
Well, welcome back. I know everybody's having fun, so I'm almost embarrassed to suggest that people have to take their seats.
Just
But,
don't
welcome back.
keep this long.
That was a great start and a great bridge, I think, to our now jump forward 200 years. But it's awfully useful in thinking about that bridge to remember how diplomacy was tied up then with the events on the ground, and how some of that diplomacy is about themes that are very current. So you will, as we bridge to the Monroe Doctrine, always a little different than mentioning anything that's historical in a room that has real historians in it, but not too different. So, Monroe Doctrine is a joint operation with the British. And only the very adroit diplomacy of Mr. Monroe keeps it from being, in fact, a joint declaration. So that it goes down in history, as this American proclamation, which is wholly dependent on British force to, in fact, keep it in place. We're not always that adroit with our diplomacy sometimes these days, but maybe that's the problem of having too much force ourselves. And remember that there are questions from the very beginning of this period that are still super live today. This question of endless wars, of intervention in foreign places, debated constantly. How much? Well, you remember that famous phrase of Adams about defending our principles with going out abroad in search of foreign monsters to destroy. That is a direct reference to the pressures to intervene in the various Latin American struggles of the 1820s. And so we are 200 years later arguing back and forth about how much of exactly this same problem we're going to be involved in. This does suggest, if nothing else, that we probably won't resolve the question. So clearly, Latin America, a huge area of importance, area in which the United States has often claimed primacy and then proceeded to ignore, an area where we are often criticized for one kind of policy or another, or absence of policy. And obviously, we're not going to talk about all of American policy in Latin America in an hour plus, and it's a continent. But what we thought we would do is pull out three sort of areas to talk about and delve into those a bit, not trying to be exhaustive, trying to sort of titillate your questions with some headlines, and then open it up for questions. I have three extraordinarily experienced colleagues with me. Their short bios are in your program. You can, by the way, also, beginning of the page of speakers, it shows an icon that you get, the QR code. If you Google that, if you really want to know, you will find long biographies of all of us. We're going to talk from the stage, from the seats here, but I don't know if we know you're the first. I don't know if you want to take your position or wait to talk from here. So we have, for the first subject, we're going to talk a little about the sort of ebb and flow of democracy and where that is in Latin America, U.S. policy today. And Ambassador Gutierrez, who is going to talk about that, has been Ambassador to Argentina, the Assistant Secretary of State for Latin America. He served all over Latin America. Great background. Then we're going to talk about a little bit about what's happening in the economy and huge influence of the economy on both life, politics, and diplomacy. And we can't stay out of that one. We have a huge balance of trade Mexico alone stays consistently in the top 4 trading partners of the United States. I think the last statistic I saw was something like $1 million a minute in cross-border trade between the U.S. and Mexico. Anybody who thinks we should just go to war and ignore them, I think again. And so we've got Ambassador Doctrine talking about that, and investment with 4 different Latin American countries. So, incredible depth of experience again. And then third, we're going to talk about political and economic instability, which obviously is something else that preoccupies us a great deal. And Ambassador Luis Arriaga will speak about that, and he again, multiple embassies, service in Latin America. So we're really bringing you a lot more depth than we're probably going to reach in subjects today, but encourage you to ask questions as a result of that depth. So if I can ask Lena, you can take the podium. Donna, if you would, I'm going to stay here, and Donna, you and Luis, if you would come on up and take your seats, we will commence. And Lena, over to you.
Oh, sure. Hello. Honored to be here in Monticello. Second time here. Beautiful place. I have to confess that my 3 daughters want to really get married. But as they told me, when I told them what a beautiful campus UVA has, and Jefferson designed it and put everything into it, they reminded me that Jefferson learned everything he knew and going to marry. I love both universities. Virginia's lucky to have them. And I'm humbled in the presence of so many historians. So everything I say will be subject to review, I'm sure. But I am a practitioner, but I do teach at George Washington University, a couple of courses and all that. So I do not pretend to know everything, but I'll give you my 2 cents. That's all I can do. And I am very pleased that we're talking about Latin America, because we seldom see much attention paid to Latin America, either in Washington or in the United States writ large. These days, understandably, there's a war in Ukraine, the Middle East is in flames, and a lot of stuff is happening in Asia, Taiwan, and everything. But Latin America is still tremendously important to the United States. I will only remind, as Ragosta said, of our trade relations. $1.9 trillion in annual trade with Latin America. Mexico, depending on the price of oil, is either number 1 or number 2 trade partner. And answer Canada's right there. So we depend on each other. One sneezes, the other one coughs. If there's a refugee crisis in the Caribbean, we will hear from the governor of Florida and the governors of Texas and all these places where refugees go to. And of course, right now, the situation on the border, where tens of thousands of Latin Americans are trying to cross the border into the United States. I think all these facts mandate a closer focus into Latin America. And we have shared values. I mean, going back to the time of independence, we rebelled against European monarchies. And you see very close relations and inspiration that the Latin American founding fathers, people like Bolívar, San Martin, and others, took from our founding fathers. Belgrano, who was one of the Argentine founding fathers, carried in his knapsack George Washington's speeches. And the United States was very active in the early days in trying to help some of these Latin American countries, as Dr. Walker said, Brazil. At one point, I think, Argentina and Brazil fought a war, an early war, and the U.S. had advisors helping both navies fight each other, but I don't think that was the intent. But it shows how we were heartened that others were, following our example. So here comes President Monroe in 1823 and declares America for the Americans. What an act of chutzpah, right? I mean, he's telling all these powers of the world, of Europe, stay out. This is our hemisphere. You have no business here. Of course, there were other motives as well. I mean, we didn't want, we didn't want the Europeans coming back and trying to regain some of the colonies. And Ambassador Neumann is right. Without the British Navy, the Monroe Doctrine would not have the key to enforce it. So I would submit at the beginning, the Monroe Doctrine was a noble gesture, even though it did have, selfish reasons for the United States. But in the early days, it was well received. Now, as our history became more complicated, and I think the question was asked about slavery in Brazil. I teach a class on Cuba, so I will mention Cuba throughout my presentation. Cuba was the next to last country to abolish slavery in 1886, 2 years before Brazil. And you see, from the time of Jefferson, you see American presidents casting an eye southward to Cuba. And in many cases, there are southern interests who would like to have Cuba as a slave state, to have the Union with the Union expanding westward and all these states. There were going to be free states. There was no counterpoint. So from the time of Jefferson, and more intensively when presidents like Polk were there, the U.S. is trying to acquire Spain. And there are some people called the filibusteros, as I was reminded, who are trying to intervene in Latin America, perhaps seeking annexation to the U.S. So in Cuba you had four currents. You had those who wanted to stay with Spain, which was a dwindling minority, those who wanted more autonomy, those who wanted annexation to the U.S., and then the eventual winners, Jose Marti and others, who advocated independence for Cuba. But I would argue that in the U.S. there have been two impulses from the beginning. I mean, these opinions were not universal. There was division. Many Americans wanted to follow George Washington's farewell speech of no foreign entanglements, do not get involved in European matters, wars, etc. And there were others who saw a mission for the United States, a manifest destiny, later on making the world safe for democracy, etc., that we needed to have a part in world affairs. And sometimes people spoke out of both sides of their mouth. For example, John Quincy Adams said in one of his speeches, America does not go abroad to search for monsters to destroy. At the same time, John Quincy Adams would say, naturally Cuba will have to fall into the U.S. orbit at some point. So these two impulses are very present throughout the U.S. When President McKinley was urged to declare war on Cuba, when William Randolph Hearst's newspapers declared war on Spain to help the Cuban independence movement, half the country did not want anything to do with Cuba, but the other half was motivated by the Hearst newspapers and others, which reported regularly on atrocities in Cuba by the Spaniards. So, in the beginning, I would say relations were excellent between the U.S. and Latin America. Although Bolivar, the counterpart to Washington, had some misgivings about when the first Pan-American Conference is called, he advocated not inviting the United States. In fact, his position did not win the day. The U.S. was invited, but the U.S. representative arrived the day after the conference and finished because we didn't have the internet or air travel and all that. So the first big challenge to the Monroe Doctrine was, I think, the Mexican War. When Texas, of course, declares its independence and asks to be annexed to the U.S., and under President Polk, the Mexican War takes place, and a large percentage of Mexico is now what we consider U.S. territory, California, Arizona, Mexico, and on, a large swath of the western United States. And we should not forget that many Mexicans are taught in grade school that this was part of Mexico. So we should always bear that in mind in relation to Mexico. There is a past, and we ignore it to our peril. I would say the most positive influence of the Monroe Doctrine was during the American Civil War, when we were busy fighting and killing each other, and the French took advantage by trying to intervene in Mexico, invited by a faction of the Mexican political system, the Conservative Party. And they tried to install Emperor Maximilian, who was an heir to the Austrian throne at one point. Why not one? We got a kingdom for you. How about Mexico? So they installed it in 1864. And the U.S. was too busy to care or to do anything about it until 1865, after the Civil War, where the message was clear: get out. And the Monroe Doctrine was invoked. The French started pulling out, and poor Maximilian was left with his Mexican allies and wound up shot by a firing squad. But I would submit that that was a positive instance where the Monroe Doctrine was applied. And then, of course, there was the case of Cuba when the battleship Maine blew up in Havana Harbor in 1898. And throughout the country, the motto was, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. And President McKinley of Ohio, who was really more of a pacifist by nature, tried desperately to acquire Cuba from the Spanish one last time. But the Spanish, who are stubborn people, I can say that because all my ancestors are Spanish, said no. Heck no, this is our territory. La isla siempre leal. The island will always be loyal to us. And that resulted in, the history of Teddy Roosevelt meeting the Rough Riders of San Juan Hill, which was an act of bravery and stupidity because he just went up the hill, facing the Spanish fire. The rest is history. And the U.S., of course, after many years of acquiring Cuba, the U.S. was divided. What do you do about Cuba? Finally, Cuba's in our hands. What do we do? And half the country wanted to give it its independence, as we had promised. The other half said, not so fast. And there was born the Platt Amendment, which was like a sword of Damocles hanging over the Cuban Republic. The Platt Amendment, in addition to giving us Guantanamo, the naval base in eastern Cuba, as a coaling station. We needed coaling stations at that time for battleships to move. They installed a provision that said the United States has a right to intervene in Cuban affairs and maintain stability. So the first 34 years of Cuban independence, everybody's looking behind their back at the schoolmarm U.S. or calling them and saying, we have a problem here, can you solve it for us? So even though Teddy Roosevelt has an imperialistic reputation, Panama, etc. And then, as we learned, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. In the case of Cuba, in 1906, Teddy Roosevelt was president, he had bigger fish to fry. So when the Cubans said, come back, that's the last thing he wanted to do. But he was obligated by the Platt Amendment. So there we see the two interests in the United States with respect to Latin America. Either leave them alone, non-interventionist, or intervention. After the Spanish-American War, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Philippines, Guam, etc. come to the U.S. orbit, and Cuba becomes independent in 1902. But then, what we see in Latin America is all these new republics, which are developing and growing, etc. Many of them need money. Where do you get money? European banks. So they started borrowing and borrowing and borrowing money. And then, when the bankers came in to collect their loans, some countries said, no, we can't afford it. We're not going to pay you. So we see movements by France, Britain, German battleships off the coast of Venezuela, saying you're going to pay, or we'll force you to pay. So enter Teddy Roosevelt again, who comes up with a Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And the Roosevelt corollary states, Europeans stand back, we will intervene with our Latin American neighbors, and we'll ensure that your debts get paid. But of course, it's involved intervention in some countries in the hemisphere, Dominican Republic from 1916 to 1924, Haiti from 1915 to 1934, Nicaragua numerous times, other places in Central America. And there, the Monroe Doctrine's reputation, of course, in Latin America, went down. The Latin Americans did not like the fact that Americans were intervening in their affairs. I mean, from our point of view, in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, what we said was, we're going to fix your customs and your economy, and so to enable these countries to pay back Europeans and keep the Europeans out. But the road to hell is probably paved with good intentions here, because at the end of the day, this was not appreciated in Latin America. So after years of U.S. intervention and in the affairs of many countries, enter FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the other Roosevelt. And he also changed matters. He came up with a new policy called the Good Neighbor Policy, 1933. FDR came in and said, we will no longer intervene in your affairs. What? What do you mean? We had FDR's good friend, Sumner Wells, who was a charge in Cuba in 1933, soon after FDR comes to power, saying, the Cubans are revolting, send me some ships to a place in Havana Harbor, some troops able to deploy. And he's shocked that his friend FDR said, no, I'm not going to intervene. You're not. So Sumner Wells decides, well, there are other ways. I'll become a proconsul, and I will refuse recognition of this new revolutionary government, because in those days, countries had to be recognized, governments had to be recognized. And if we withdrew recognition, then you wouldn't get investment, you wouldn't get trade, etc. And Wells and others were able to use other tools in order to impose U.S. policies. The problem with a non-intervention policy is that it led, in many cases, to the imposition of military dictatorships. Oh, the U.S. doesn't care, okay, so we're going to take over. And it became an era where you had people like Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, Somoza in Nicaragua, and others with decades of dictatorship, to the point that I think talking about Trujillo or Somoza, I forget which one, FDR was reported to have said about Somoza, he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son. Which seemed to be the U.S. policy. Okay, we're not going to intervene, but if you have an SOB who's pro-U.S., okay, your funeral. So that was pretty much the U.S. policy until after World War II, of course, when the Cold War started. And our prism toward Latin America became the Cold War prism. In fact, George Kennan was sent to Latin America to do a report on the situation there, and he reported which countries were pro-U.S. and which were not pro-U.S. And that dictated the way we proceeded without looking at other factors, human rights, democracy, etc. So this was a very Cold War focused period. You had Guatemala in 1954. The U.S. intervened to change the government. Dominican Republic, 1965, troops were sent. Of course, Cuba, the Bay of Pigs, which is a total disaster, 1961. Going even down to 1983, Grenada, and Panama in 1990, when the U.S. intervened to either stop communism or getting rid of people like Manuel Noriega in Panama, and others, until the end of history. When the Berlin Wall fell, 1989, and Francis Fukuyama declared, this is the end of history. Sorry, historians, that was it for you. What he meant was, the Cold War, the world as we knew it, is over. We're never going to think in those terms again. In Latin America, this resulted in a tremendous movement toward free trade with the Americas. The Latin Americans were demanding free trade with the U.S. Before, there was dependencia theory saying, you know, if you get associated with the United States, it's going to cause poverty, etc. Now, they were lining up at Foggy Mountain demanding free trade. And people like Steve Thompson, Steve, are you here? UVA graduate. He was one of the warriors for fighting for free trade in the hemisphere. And to our surprise, it was harder negotiating within the U.S. government to get NAFTA approved and all these other free trade agreements and talk to the Latin Americans. So a new era. But then we had some wrinkles because, you know, we had a consensus in Miami in 1992 when the leaders of the hemisphere met without Cuba. But all 34 had been elected democratically. I said, wow, that's it, that's the end of our job. All of us who work in Latin America, and by the way, you have 120 years to do the following this. Latin American experience. I'm not going to say who has the most, but anyway. We thought, okay, that's our job. Let's go to free trade, human rights, go sing Kumbaya, go off into the sunset. But then we had the phenomenon of people who were democratically elected trying to destroy democracy from above. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Aristide in Haiti, and some others. So ever since we have had sort of a back and forth on democracy, we've had pink tides where center-left governments come to power, proclaiming, you know, new policies, distancing from the U.S., and then a conservative tide after that, and now sort of a mix in the hemisphere. We have countries that are examples of, you know, where things are going well, like Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Uruguay, Ecuador. We have 3 totally authoritarian regimes in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Although Venezuela now, with the Barbados Accord, and Ambassador Neumann mentioned the podcast by Peter Romero, American Diplomat. I commend you to listen to him on what this means for Venezuela going forward. So we're going back and forth, but and if you look at some polls, you might get a little disheartened. Only 48% of Latin Americans support democracy. On the other hand, they have the highest level of democratic participation in the world, at 67%. They have the highest percentage of women parliamentarians. There is some democratic fatigue. I mean, we see it in this country. Political parties are on the downturn a bit, and many are looking for that savior, that a man or woman with a white horse is going to solve everything. You see that in Argentina today with this election between Massa and Milei being more of a Trump-inspired candidate, and Massa being a traditional Peronist, but who's beholden to Cristina Kirchner and some of the not so nice elements in Argentina. So that election is a toss-up. I don't know how we'll react, but we'll see. So, so don't forget, Latin America is very important. It still has tremendous problems. Haiti, Guatemala, Honduras are very vulnerable populations. COVID had a devastating effect on the hemisphere, but the U.S. has no choice but to engage and to develop a vision like we had with Roosevelt, Kennedy, and Reagan for the hemisphere, which these days, unfortunately, there isn't much attention paid for. And don't forget that Latinos are the largest minority in the U.S., 62.57 million in the 2020 census, 19.1% of the population, 37.5 million Mexicans, and then followed by Puerto Ricans, Salvadorans, Dominicans, Cubans, etc. We are American. And those Hispanic, the Hispanic population here plays a very important role in remittances in helping a lot of these governments keep afloat, keep their heads afloat. Over 145 billion in remittances that are going to the Western Hemisphere. So we should continue to engage early enough. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to all of you for joining us. So after I left the Foreign Service, I went to work for a Miami law firm, Still Heffner Davis. And while there, I was made co-chair of the Trade and Competition Group. And during that time, my partner co-chair and I wrote an article for the national interest that we called Poverty and Globalization. And our thesis was that trade could be an important tool in reducing poverty around the world, but had never been given the opportunity to do so for three reasons: the way trade negotiations were conducted, the way trade agreements were enforced, and the way trade was marketed. And because up to that time, most of my experience was in Latin America and the Caribbean, and because we were living in Miami, we tested our thesis against what we had seen and experienced in the hemisphere. I had devoted a lot of my efforts to building ties between the countries of the hemisphere, among the countries of the hemisphere, including through trade. And so we looked at the hemisphere through that prism. And that's the prism I'd like to talk about today. We heard from Dr. Walker that trade was an important consideration in the minds of the founding fathers of the United States in the years leading up to the Monroe Doctrine. I'd like to talk about a more recent experience that Lino just touched on, right? My experience with the NAFTA trade agreement in particular. And as I considered that experience, and I looked back at our article in the national interest, I have to admit that while my co-author and I touched on the link between trade and democracy, we did not explore it adequately and did not understand how forcefully it would manifest here in the United States. So one of the strongest advocates for trade as an effective weapon in the fight against poverty was former U.S. Trade Representative Robert Zellick, no marshmallow, who at a ministerial for the Free Trade Area of the Americas in 2002 said, "Our objective is not to increase trade. Our objective is to grow our economies, reduce poverty, generate jobs, offer opportunities, and above all, to create hope." Even as he made that statement, however, U.S. negotiators, like those of our counterparts in other countries in the FTA round and trade talks around the world, took the approach that trade should principally enhance the welfare of producers, classic mercantilism as Dr. talked about. Even Adam Smith had said that local producers were very good at proving that what was in their interest was in the best interests of their countries as a whole, even when that was often not the case. And despite the fact that all of us, even merchants, even producers, are in some way consumers, in the negotiations, producer interests, special interests, if you will, took precedent over consumer welfare. In the long run, that approach closed off right from the start a key opportunity to both use trade more effectively as a poverty reduction tool and to broaden public support for trade agreements. That was true even and we expanded the trade agenda to include topics such as labor rights and environmental impact. I became the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Mexico and the Caribbean just in time to begin negotiations of the NAFTA side agreements on labor and environment. And so I joined the negotiating team for the labor side agreement. In those discussions, we talked a lot about jobs, about raising wages, about the right to unionize. We didn't talk at all about workers as consumers who would benefit from trade liberalization that reduced the price of goods. Former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers once said that everyone who loses their job because a factory closes up and production moves to Mexico believes they are a victim of free trade. But no one on Christmas morning considers himself a beneficiary of free trade and thanks negotiators for lowering the prices on imported toys so there are double the number of packages under the tree. One of the outcomes of this biased approach in favor of protecting producers was that the changes in domestic economic laws, regulations, and policies that were expected to be supportive of trade either never occurred or were distorted to protect domestic business elites. For example, significant privatization programs in Latin America often simply converted public monopolies with regulation into unregulated private monopolies. Many of these reforms were part of the famous Washington Consensus, right, which came to be vilified as that consensus in favor of these reforms disappeared. And in Latin America and the Caribbean, the economic environment became dominated by what was termed reform fatigue. Societies grew tired of dealing with economic reforms that failed to fulfill their promise of growth and development. And these societies were also growing tired of democracy. Many of you are familiar with the Latino Barometer organization, which polls public opinion throughout the region. As far back as 2001, their poll of 17 countries showed that about 2/3 of respondents were dissatisfied with the results of democracy. Recurring economic crises, unequal wealth distribution, lack of social welfare measures, strained democratic systems, leading to social unrest and political upheaval. So although citizens in many of these countries were barely a generation away from having lived under authoritarian regimes and brutal dictatorships, they were already tired of a system of government that guarantees free and fair elections at regular intervals, but brings no concrete benefits. Perhaps the fatigue would not have been so great had the expectations not been set so high. And I confess I was part of setting those expectations. Once the labor and environmental side agreements were finalized, NAFTA negotiations ended. Our job in the Bureau of what was then ARA in the American Republic's area, now the more appropriately named Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, turned to building understanding of the agreements with important constituencies here in the United States. Constituencies, people who wanted to know more, and with greater knowledge, perhaps might write favorable articles in their local press, even encourage their senators and representatives to vote in favor of the NAFTA treaty and legislation. This is the domestic side of diplomacy. I always say that in the Foreign Service, 50% of your job is explaining the U.S. to the host country. The other 50% is explaining the host country to the U.S. And in my case, that domestic 50% meant going back to steel country in western Pennsylvania, where I was born and raised, to explain how NAFTA would create export sector manufacturing jobs that would pay substantially more than jobs not related to exports. Yes, our argument acknowledged that some jobs would be lost, but hey, not to worry. Trade adjustment assistance would come to the rescue, with skills training for anyone who wanted it, and income support during the interim period before the new jobs come out. Now, I wasn't just repeating somebody else's talking points. I was on a mission. I knew how important it was to create that Monticello that you talked about, because I'd seen what happened to western Pennsylvania steel towns without government understanding and support for workers displaced by trade or other factors. More efficiently produced imported steel and more automated production right here in the United States had caused many manufacturing plants in the Ohio River Valley to shut down, and many towns to lose not just their principal economic activity, but their reason to exist. Young men with whom I graduated high school, guys who believed they didn't need a college degree to have a stable middle-class life working in the steel mills, the guys we affectionately called steel mill hunks, spent years not working, and maybe they fixed cars or painted houses in a positive sense of way, while their wives were cashiers at Giant Eagle. But that middle-class stability they'd been promised proved ephemeral. And unfortunately, many of the promises I was making about NAFTA would prove misleading. Trade adjustment assistance, for example, which had actually been around since 1962, when President John Kennedy included it as part of a new trade platform designed to counter Soviet influence around the world. What was well-intended, but inadequate. In his book, Trade is Not a Four-Letter Word, former ex-Im President Frank Hochberg noted that workers who successfully landed new jobs after using TAA typically took a 20% pay cut. And despite updates to the program, the Senate in 1993, when President Clinton proposed specific support for workers displaced by NAFTA, TNA was never funded sufficiently to cover all workers who could have benefited. I want to go back for a minute to JFK's belief that trade should be an instrument for the West to gain political influence. Some of the U.S. negotiators in the NAFTA negotiations and later in the FTAA talks, and likely those involved in other trade discussions, were primarily focused on the economic impacts. How much GDP would grow, how exchange rates could be stabilized, no problem with that. That was their job. But in particular, those of us in the Department of State believed we were also engaged in talks about national security. To describe it briefly, we subscribed to what later became known as the Tom Friedman theory of golden arches, that no two countries that both had McDonald's had fought a war since each had gotten its McDonald's. That theory is influenced, of course. What we believed our job was to use trade to build friendships, understanding among nations, and to promote peace. And what better place to start than right here in this hemisphere with the two countries with whom we share land borders. But my message to the steelworkers of Pennsylvania missed another critical point. Trade wasn't their only challenge. There was a host of changes occurring in the world that demanded new training, new skills, and new mindsets to keep U.S. workers and the U.S. itself globally competitive. The FTAA, which I mentioned earlier, was just one of 23 initiatives that emerged from the 1994 Summit of the Americas that Lino touched on, the first summit of the modern era. I served as coordinator for policy for that summit, and as we were designing the agenda along with our counterparts from the other 33 participating countries, we on the U.S. side often said things like, oh, our healthcare system sucks too, or we have corruption in our police forces, we really share a lot. What too many of us really meant was, you have problems, we can solve them. Now, 20 years have passed since the breakdown of talks to build a free trade area in the Americas, demonstrate, I believe, that we do share an amazing amount in this hemisphere, starting with what's required to meet the challenges of the 21st century world, the most essential of which is quality education. I'm sure many of you know of the PISA exams, Performance Indicators of Student Assessment. PISA is sponsored by the OECD, and since 1997, it has every 3 years measured the proficiency of 15-year-olds in math, science, and reading comprehension in a growing number of countries around the world. In 2022, the last year PISA was administered, those participants included the United States, Canada, and 14 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. The results of this first pandemic exam will be released on December 5th, and education experts expect that COVID will have caused outcomes to fall across the board. But the assessment for Latin America already starts from a very low base. Results from the last tests in 2018 as in 2015 and in 2012, show that students in the region are far behind their peers in other parts of the world, just above sub-Saharan Africa. According to a World Bank report, Latin America faces an education crisis. And disappointing performance in education is becoming all too common here in the United States as well. In October 2022, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, known as the nation's report card, showed the strongest declines ever in math for both 8th and 4th graders. Only 26% of 8th graders were rated proficient in math. Only 36% of those in 4th grade. Talk about a need to unite around a common problem. Now, I know we do have many scholars in the room, and you understand much better than I how you can pick and choose your research to make a point in a forum like this where we're not being peer reviewed. So I'm going to pick some of my favorite research and say that there is a link between education and support for democracy, and contend that the link does not begin in college. Some of the research I read shows that it actually starts in primary school, where students should learn to think. And while the relationship isn't absolute, nations that engage in free trade often find themselves leaning towards democracy, as the transparency and accountability required for successful trade relations often align with democratic principles. So I hope some of what I've said makes you think about this hemisphere, which, as we've heard from Leo, is important and should be more important in our minds. Think about the connections between the United States, Canada, and other countries in the region. Think about the challenges that governments, academia, private sector, civil society all confront together and need to work on together. Manos a la obra, right? Vamos al trabajo, let's get to work. One other point about 21st century challenges, by the way. I have a lot of war stories in these remarks, and so you can feel pretty confident that I developed those on my own. But 2 sections of these comments came directly from ChatGPT. Can you tell which ones?
That certainly brought us a brilliant introduction of how diplomacy, economics, and democracy get tangled. Bruce, over to you to make the situation more complicated.
Hello everyone. First thing I'm going to do is to thank the Thomas Jefferson Foundation and the Academy for inviting me to participate in this important conversation. I have to tell you that as an immigrant, it is personally meaningful for me to speak at the home of the author of the Declaration of Independence, a foundational document for my adopted country. So it's pretty special. It's also a pleasure to join this conversation and share the stage with 2 very distinguished colleagues. It's also a bit intimidating, but I'm going to give it a hard try. Yes. So I've been asked to address how do we balance the democratic values that we hold dearly, that we try to uphold, against what may be required of us to do as diplomats, to confront complex set of challenges in our hemisphere, such as political instability, international crime, authoritarianism, and efforts by countries outside of the region to increase their influence at our expense. Among these, is one that I want to share a little bit of my experience with you, is migration. Because migration is at the center of what we're doing in Central America and in many other countries. And let me tell you, trying to balance our values with what we need to do is, it's not easy. Like a friend of mine used to say, it's like trying to kill a flea. It ain't easy. But I will try to share with you about the process that we go through in trying to address these challenges. And I think we have how many diplomats here, all of us will do it differently, but I think there are some key questions that we ask ourselves as we meet these challenges, and as we try to craft policy, as we try to implement policy on the ground. And the first question is, of course, what are the core U.S. interests in the particular country you're in? This is the starting point, and and this is what defines everything we do. It is different for different countries. It is different for different administrations. I happen to be engaged in dealing with migration, representing an administration that appeared to want to stop it at any cost, and implemented some rather controversial policies that were difficult to implement on the ground. That's one of the issues that you have to address. Another one of the questions that you have to start with is, what is the history of the host country and its relationship with the U.S.? And this is why this is so important to hear what you have to say, hear what Dino and Donna have to say. It is nearly impossible to be effective in communicating and managing a bilateral relationship without having a historical perspective on those relations, because it changes from time to time. I can recall when I was a young man in Guatemala, I hated the United States. Why did I hate the United States? Because they were supporting regimes that appeared to be against the interests of the Guatemalan people. At the time, it was Guatemalan, right? So when I look at that, you know, there was military trainers, and some of the things that the governments were doing were not really nice, and they enjoy U.S. support. So I fast forward to today, and the role of the United States in countries in Central America has changed completely. The people of Central America look at the U.S. not as the evil interfering power, but as actually as a beacon of hope, because they see that we are the only ones in their own eyes that can help them along, that can help bring the democracy. So things change, and you have to be aware of that, because you have to understand it, and you have to understand the people you're dealing with. Another question that you ask yourself is, what are the values of the population under view of the U.S.? Again, you need to understand what drives people in your host country, what their perspectives are, so that you're able to communicate better and you're able to conduct your policies better. Same thing with understanding the democratic values and the policies of the countries that you deal with. So you ask yourself all these questions and you begin to deal with the situation. In the case of migration, to be a little specific, I happen to be dealing with it in the United States from the perspective of law enforcement, and then when I went to Guatemala, from multiple perspectives. And it wasn't easy, because it was a phenomenon that not sure we quite understood. You know, a lot of people coming to the U.S., not good. A lot of people just entering the U.S. without any kind of order, not good. But it was important for us to understand it and to know that a lot of these processes have been going on for decades. So when you go to the Highlands of Guatemala, you begin to run into this, what would be called mansions here. But these are these huge homes in the middle of nowhere, homes that were built by migrants who were sending their money back. You walk to the cemetery and you find tombs with the American flag and the Guatemalan flag. You go to homes and you see two flags flying. So these are truly binational societies. And so it was important for us to understand that so that we could craft a policy that would help us address it. That was one thing. The other thing was that we dealt with governments that are pretty corrupt. And that made a difference, because that meant that we really couldn't trust what they did, what they did, you know, with us. We knew that they were mostly looking at lining their pockets, and if possible, with our money. Fortunately, we were aware of that, and we were able to craft policies that attempted to deal with the situation. Besides corruption, we also had to deal with narco trafficking. I mean, you have in Central America, I can speak about Guatemala with some knowledge, where you have the entire, along the border with Mexico and Guatemala, a lot of the mayors are mayors that were put there by by the cartels, because they need to have access to that. How do you deal with that? Do you talk to the mayor, or what do you do? No easy answers. And then, of course, you have cartels that have actually penetrated the congresses of some of these places, and they are able to prevent governments from governing. So what I just wanted to tell you is that those of us who go to the field and try to address these challenges, it's rather complicated, and it changes from administration to administration, it changes from country to country, but ultimately what really drives us is our commitment to the Constitution, our commitment to our oath of office, and we manage the situation as best we can depending on who is in office. Sometimes we have Democrats, sometimes we have Republicans. That really doesn't matter to us, because what we try to do is fundamentally carry out the policy, but always keeping in mind what our oath to the Constitution was. And this was particularly important during our previous administration, where there were some challenges that we deal with. But anyway, I know we're running out of time. Maybe we should leave it for. Okay. No, I mean, those were kind of the basic points. I'd rather talk about specific issues that I think that may be relevant today, like migration, corruption, threats to democracy as we speak. If you pay a little bit of attention in Guatemala, we are now watching a slow motion coup d'etat, which is different than the traditional coup d'etats. This is a coup d'etat conducted by civilians using civilian institutions like the courts, the public ministry, the attorney general, and it's fascinating professionally, but it's also very depressing, because while they're not likely to get away with it, they will do a lot of damage, and as Tom mentioned today, it's totally unnecessary, given the needs of the country, given its potential, and so we'll be happy to talk about that.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for getting. You're really good about getting us back on schedule, and I appreciate that. We've got some time for questions. We've got a lot of interesting themes out here. Tensions between stability and economic interest, between stability and democracy. So I think we have a microphone that we're carrying around. Okay, so the question over here, please wait for the microphone, because we're recording this and you can't be heard otherwise. So.
Well, good morning, and thank you for your scores of public service. I have a simple, spelled simplistic question for any or all of you, for which I recognize there is no simple answer, if any answer. But given the checkered past of American policies towards Latin America, and with the immigration crisis at our border, are you able to articulate any specific actions that you believe today the United States should or could take to help provide greater stability financially, physically, and politically to reduce the migration to the United States from Latin America?
I think we could go across the line with that one, but I'm not going to help with it. Lino, you got what you want to jump in?
Well, I mean, on paper, what you should do is help these countries improve conditions in their own country, so people wouldn't feel the need to leave. But it's very complicated. Citizen security being a tremendous problem. Cartels, gangs, etc. We have to control our borders. There's no other way. But dialogue and try to help these countries with different programs, be they economic development, education, etc.
I would say that our committee should down and have a serious, comprehensive conversation about migration. The fact is that the United States needs migrants, there's no question about it. So we need to figure out a way of how they can come in, work, and leave. There are programs that already exist. Most migrants, by virtue of what they do with their money, they send their money back. I think they would be happy to come here and work for a few months, go back to their families. And that's one of the ways. There are many other pieces of legislation that appear to be on hold, but unfortunately they have become beholden to our politics, and therefore they're not sitting down to talk about this seriously. And in the meantime, those of us who are out in the field are trying to deal with the situation with the tools we're given, but much more to be done here to help us deal with the problem.
So I'll go back to the point I made about education. I think the best thing we can do is work together on the issues of education, whether that be, including in the United States, more respect for teachers, more parental involvement in education. Lino says it's right, we need more training development assistance in this region. But you know, our migration crisis has to be solved in Washington. And you know, but Ted Kennedy and John McCain, that was the last chance we had to come up with a really solid response to immigration policy in this country, and we lost it. We need to mount that kind of coalition again. I know it's very important in DC these days.
Well, I'm just going to add to that and underline the point I just made. We have not had a new immigration policy in many years. And we have basic issues that people really, really resist dealing with, because clearly the United States cannot accept an endless, overwhelming supply of people. And clearly it needs immigrants. So you're going to have to draw a line somewhere. Wherever you draw that line, there are going to be humanitarian cases on the other side that will make you weak. This is making it very difficult for the Democratic Party to come together on any actual standard that we will enforce. On the other hand, if you try to enforce blanket closures, you do real harm to our own economy, and you set up something that probably can't work very well in terms of our own laws. We have a system now that doesn't work in terms of handling asylum cases because we are massively understaffed and have years-long backlog. Clearly, that's something we can solve too. But clearly, you cannot solve any of these problems with a my way or the highway approach. Close the borders, go to war, bankrupt the economy. We have, what, $1 million of trade a minute with Mexico. We're going to have a war to close the border. Probably not very smart. And just endless streams of people is clearly not acceptable to the American people. This means there is going to have to be a measure of compromise. Maybe a dirty word, but your alternative to compromise is in action and failure, not the triumph of one policy or another. So a large part of the answer to your question is here in the States. That belongs to that, please. Great question. Okay, other questions? I don't want to turn only to one, but we got one right. Oh, okay. Okay.
Thank you all for coming. You wonderfully articulated the various incidents in our history where the Monroe Doctrine came into play. For anyone who would care to comment, China's now making massive investments in Cuba. How would you like to see the administration address the needs of the Monroe Doctrine today, given that?
Yeah. Well, the Chinese protect their money very well. They're not going to go in recklessly into these countries. They try to work out the best deal for themselves. So I think the press has exaggerated some of these reports about Chinese investment in Cuba. It is true that the Chinese are investing throughout the whole region, very skillfully, buying up natural resources, etc., and selling them on this Silk Road concept that they have. But I think we just need to be aggressive and, fight the trade wars with our better products. In all these countries that recognize what's going on. But the Monroe Doctrine wouldn't have applicability necessarily when you're dealing in free trade matters like that.
We got one question over here.
So this is mostly directed at Ambassador Hallock, but I hope I didn't totally butcher your name. But partially. That's okay. My name's butchered my whole life, so I'm used to it. I was a great advocate of free trade. I thought NAFTA was a wonderful idea. Since NAFTA, the top income of top 10% of U.S. wealth is now held by the top 10% of the population owns 70% of U.S. wealth. Before NAFTA, they owned 61%. Household income of the top 0.01% has gone up 400%. Top point of 0.09% has gone up 300%. Top point of 0.9% is up 100%. Bottom, the household income in the U.S. is 1.4 million for the top 1% and 20%. The bottom 20% is 37,000 a year. This, by the way, is all from the Council on Foreign Relations, so this is not something I'm making up. And the U.S., in terms of income imbalance, is below every nation in Europe except Greece, and below almost every nation in China except those on the Saudi and the Arabian Peninsula. Same thing for Mexico. Canada has much less income inequality than we do. So I'm wondering, in listening to your defense of free trade, is free trade, since NAFTA, working for the majority of the American people? It's clearly working for the top 1 or even 10% of the country.
That's an interesting question, because I was afraid that the message I was sending was that I was anti-free trade, given what I had seen that happened to the community where I grew up. But I am in support of free trade. I think it can work, and I'm glad you took that message. I think it can work, but you can't look at trade in isolation, right? And the reason we have these tremendous income inequalities, growth in income inequality in the United States, and we have the continuing problem of income inequality throughout Latin America, particularly in Brazil, where it's one of the largest Gini coefficients in the world, is because we don't have a set of economic policies that's designed to, I think, take worker and consumer welfare into account. If somehow we could take these considerations and look at economic policy as a whole and say, okay, trade does this, so social welfare has to do this. These are industries where we can be competitive in the 21st century. What do we need to do to make sure our workers keep up with those kind of development? I was selfish and just said, well, I'll do the trade part of this, right? But it's so much more complicated in all of these countries. How do you have that famous social safety net that really works? And how do you convince the CEO that maybe his workers would be better off if they could afford to buy the Model T? We used to have CEOs that thought like that. So I think we need to do some proselytizing among the U.S. business community as well. And I say that after spending 20 years in the U.S. business community.
Do we have a very short, I've got one question from Stephen in the back. That is going to be our last, because we are running over. But we're going to do it anyway.
So I think the Monroe Doctrine brings up a really interesting point, and I think, again, I'm going to butcher your name as well. Ambassador Ronald, this is particularly directed at you, but I'm wondering if you believe it's more important for the U.S. to address corruption first in countries such as Venezuela that are plagued by the resource curse, and plagued by poverty. To address that first before or after we address our internal policies within the U.S. that allow us to dominate the benefits of trade, such as the sugar quota that impacts Haiti, things like that. So which do you believe we should address first, the corruption or our own policies?
I I like the either or part of the question first, so I would say yes. And you said which. So I was laughing to myself when Luis was speaking because I was in the Dominican Republic. We had a substantial anti-narcotics program there. And we knew that the guy who was in charge of the program, that the general, that we were working with most closely was thoroughly corrupt. And so we had a policy in the embassy which was as long as he doesn't steal from us. Steal from the traffickers, you know, we can't stop everything, right? But we can focus on what we can do, and that's what we can do. So I think I would answer that it's not an either-or question. I mean, we're never going to be perfect, right? But we've got to keep improving here in the United States, and we've got to learn from other countries. Again, in the DR, one of the most effective USAID programs, and Frank, maybe you knew of this even though you weren't directly involved in, was a program that USAID had established in the Dominican Republic to work with prenatal care for expectant mothers and then postnatal care to make sure that babies were, weight was taken, and they had their injections. We took that program from the Dominican Republic to Washington Heights in New York. So there's USAID investing in the United States to help us solve problems.
You've asked a great question also. Let me leave you with one last thought about diplomacy and policy in general. It is almost never an either-or question, because we always have multiple interests, and there's always tension between interests. And we almost never have the luxury of having one that is so predominant to another to be completely subordinated to it. And so a fundamental problem of policy and carrying out policy and diplomacy repeatedly is how do you advance multiple interests at the same time while minimizing the tensions between them. And there's never a simple answer. It's a great question to highlight a sort of fundamental learning point about the kind of endless struggle that we've engaged in. Well, I let us run over a little because I thought the discussion was too interesting and so tough we did it. But we really have to wrap up. We now come to lunch, which is always an important moment. I know that there are at least some people in the audience, students who are interested in diplomacy as a profession. I've got to get my colleagues out for a picture. After that, I would be glad to meet with any of you who we can move upstairs to a room. I think there are two, and we'll see what size the group is and sort of figure this out. I don't want to keep all my colleagues. I was going to suggest my colleagues join me, but actually there's a lot of people in this room who probably want to interact with me. So I'm going to grab the students myself. Then you can grab our colleagues later. We need to be back at 2 to get going for our keynote address. We've got a great speaker for you. He's very modest, so I see him grimacing at that, but Tom Shannon, who was Assistant Secretary for Latin America and for Undersecretary, all sorts of things, is an absolute great speaker, and you'll enjoy it. So I urge you to come back at 2 for retreat. If I missed anything else that I needed.
Lunch is available, boxed lunches in the dining room. You are welcome to take them anywhere in the building for your lunch, or it was a lovely day out in the balcony area or out in the outside. And we plan to be back at 2 o'clock and get going. So
colleagues, I have to grab your...
Stop recording. And let's get those lovelies back. Thank you very much.